do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Mr. Mount, good morning.
Kia ora tātou, morena. I'm joined today by Chris Merrick, who will lead the witnesses. We have three witnesses, the first two of whom are already in place, Michael Tarren-Sweeney and Charlene Rapsey. And we'll also have Tracy McIntosh today. And as I say, Mr. Merrick will lead the evidence today.
Thank you, Mr. Merrick.
Tēnā koutou, ngā kai komihana, tēnā tātou katoa, tātou ko tai mai, tēnei rā, tēnei te mihi atu. Just acknowledgements to everyone here today, and if I could just start by saying a little bit about how we might commence with these two witnesses.
And then I'll ask them for their initial statement.
Yes, and so the proposal is that we have both Professor Michael Tarren-Sweeney and Dr. Charlene Rapsey seated at the witness table. As you can see, what we will start with is Professor Tarren-Sweeney will read portions of his brief of evidence. We will then turn to Dr. Rapsey, who will read her brief of evidence, and we will allow for questions at the end, so that we can essentially, where there's overlap, there might be the ability to comment one with the other. So that's the proposal. No difficulty if Mr. Chair, you propose to deliver the affirmation to both of them at the outset.
All right, I will do that. Professor Tarren-Sweeney and Dr. Rapsey, ngā ahurangi tēnā kaurua. In terms of the Inquiries Act 2013, as you commence your evidence, I'm required to ask you, do you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you'll give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. When you speak, if you would press the switch at the bottom and the red light will be on. And I'll now leave Mr. Merrick initially to ask you the questions that he wishes. Mr. Merrick.
Yes, thank you, sir. Well, we'll start, as I've outlined, with you, Professor Tarren-Sweeney. Can I just confirm that in the open volume of documents, which is just in front of Dr. Rapsey there, that behind tab 21 you've cited a copy of your brief of evidence?
Yes, I have.
And you've signed that?
I have.
And it's true and correct?
Yes, it is.
Yes, thank you. Now, what we propose to do is to have you begin by reading your brief of evidence, and if you could commence doing that now.
Okay, thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Royal Commission for giving me the opportunity to talk today on a topic that's been my life's work. And my curriculum vitae is annexed in full at Annex 1 to this brief. I'm a clinical child psychologist, psychiatric epidemiologist and child developmental theorist, and I work as a professor of child and family psychology at Canterbury University in Christchurch, where my family and I have lived since 2006. My earlier research focused on identifying mental health difficulties experienced by children in state care using epidemiological and clinical research methods, including the development of new psychometric measures. And this was mainly based around a longitudinal study that I ran in New South Wales called the Children in Care Study between 1999 and 2011. Since then, I have advised statutory child welfare ministries and National Health Services on how to provide services for children in care in New Zealand, in Scotland, Ireland, England and Wales, and South Australia and New South Wales, bearing in mind that in Australia, child welfare is a state jurisdiction. Following on from that, my work has been referred to in the 2008 Special Commission of Inquiry into Child Protection Services in New South Wales.
Professor, excuse me intervening. If I could ask you to be mindful of the stenotyper in front of you and equally the signers who are working at high speed with technical material. So if you could keep your eye on both and pace the delivery of what you say, that will be greatly appreciated by everyone.
So if I keep an eye on the screen, then we'll, okay, terrific.
Now I think you're at paragraph 6.
Yes, and in the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists submission to the 2017 Australian Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sex abuse. The realisation that these children's mental health difficulties and their life circumstances are poorly matched to generic child and adolescent mental health services led me to work on the design of specialised mental health services for these populations. But in the latter half of my career, my focus has shifted from clinical research to measuring and understanding how these children develop over time in the midst of what are often unnatural childhoods. So today I want to provide some insights from developmental science on how the state should respond to the plight of children growing up in statutory care. In particular, my evidence will focus on those who have suffered abuse, trauma or neglect prior to their entry into state care. Because my work has not been focused on the New Zealand context, my evidence refers to the developmental needs of children growing up in statutory care generally, without addressing the specific aspects of the New Zealand care system or the specific cultural context in which it exists. Such children leave their parents' care with neurobiological systems that are adapted to cope with neglectful or abusive environments, but which are poorly adapted to normative social environments. This translates as heightened risk for various developmental, social and mental health difficulties that often persist into adulthood. And what a colleague of mine, Eamon McCrory, describes as latent vulnerability. If there's any good news from this story, it is that fortunately neurobiological development is not fixed. Children can experience psychological and neurobiological recovery in response to consistently sensitive, loving care, as well as other experiences that foster felt security. And thinking then about how society should tend to these children's care and well-being, I propose 3 priorities. The first is restoring to them the opportunity to experience and enjoy what remains of their childhood in much the same way as do other children. The second is restoring the social and familial conditions that are necessary for healthy human development and which are also the preconditions for these children's developmental recovery. And the third is ensuring that they and their caregivers are provided specialised clinical and developmental services as well as intensive caregiver support. In this first part of my evidence, I will describe the psychological development of children placed in statutory care, focusing mainly on the effects of severe maltreatment and their mental health. Firstly, when I use the word maltreatment, I'm using it as a collective term to describe child abuse and neglect. It's a term that's mostly used in the research field to describe both. The toxic effects of maltreatment on children's psychological development and well-being, particularly when this is done by children's parents or other primary caregivers, are well established. We know considerably more about these effects now than we did 20 years ago. And this is largely due to advances in neurodevelopmental science and other research advances. A range of neurobiological and psychological processes in early childhood that are critical to human social functioning are impaired by early and prolonged exposure to traumatic maltreatment. These include behavioural and emotional regulation, executive functioning, intellectual abilities, language and memory. Similarly, severe and chronic maltreatment profoundly alters children's attachment development, affecting their interpersonal relationships, how they understand and value themselves and others, the meanings children attribute to social relationships, and how they understand the minds of others, which has implications for the development of empathy. The effects of maltreatment on children's development vary somewhat depending on children's ages and stages of development at the time that they are harmed. In particular, maltreatment in the first 3 to 5 years of life has more adverse effects on children's development than maltreatment at older ages. And that's because most of the important parts of our human development occur in those first 3 to 5 years of life. There is also evidence that whilst children's development is seriously compromised by maltreatment, some of these effects can be reversed over time in response to optimal care, including the development of attachment security, while other effects tend to persist. So, for example, inattention hyperactivity and intellectual disability tend to persist despite changes in quality of care. In this next section, I want to talk a little about the effects of pre-care maltreatment on the development and mental health of children in statutory care. The protection, psychological development and well-being of a large majority of maltreated children is best served through varying levels of family support services, including specialised parenting interventions and parental drug and alcohol treatments. It goes without saying that providing effective family supports earlier rather than later is the key to arresting and preventing further developmental harm for such children. However, a relatively small proportion of children who are maltreated by their parents or other guardians have an ongoing need for care. And in modern times, these children are mostly placed into statutory care following severe and chronic maltreatment. In terms of terminology, in New Zealand, Australia and North America, statutory care is referred to as out-of-home care, whereas in the UK and Ireland the preferred term is looked after children. And out-of-home care includes placements with families, which collectively is referred to as family-based care, and placement in residential facilities, which can range from small group homes to large institutions. There are in turn two types of family-based care, namely foster care and kinship care. In New Zealand, the term for kinship care is whānau care, and this refers to placements with extended whānau, such as grandparents, uncles and aunts, and even more distant relatives. Foster care refers to placements with families who are not biologically related to the child. Whereas residential care was once the predominant form of state care, last year in Australia, only 6% of children in state care were in residence. And they were predominantly adolescents with more serious behavioural difficulties. And by comparison, in Australia, 51% of children are in whānau care and 39% in foster care.
Can I pause you there, Professor, and just ask a question about the use of residential care and why nowadays it's less used? Are you able to comment on what the research has done? Because you've talked about the detrimental effects of maltreatment on children. Is there a link between the impact of residential care on children and its lessened use over time? So historically it was used very frequently. Well, we've heard that over the last few days. Could you comment on that?
Residential the extent to which residential care is developmentally harmful is somewhat linked to the age of the child. And so the younger a child is, the more that they are in need of being nurtured by parental figures, the more it is that residential care is manifestly harmful for their development. When I first started working in child welfare in the mid-80s, and I was also working in youth justice at the time, New South Wales still had large residential services that included family groups, including infants. And over time, and I imagine New Zealand had the same, but over time, as the harmful effects of residential care have become better known, and particular for younger children, that's been increasingly reserved for those older children and adolescents who are seen to be not placeable with families.
Thank you. If we can return now to your brief.
Okay.
And I think we were at paragraph 30 and moving on. Can I just also check in with our stenographer to just check with the pace? How was the pace? Is that okay?
Good.
Thank you.
So I think it's important that we differentiate between these children and the much larger number of maltreated children who remain in their parents' care. So these children are not a random cross-section of children that are known to Oranga Tamariki. Generally speaking, in Western jurisdictions, these are children who are found by the courts to be in need of care and are involuntarily removed from their parents and have experienced the highest levels of harm. They are more likely than other maltreated children to have experienced more severe, more chronic, more pervasive, and more diverse maltreatment. This is important because whereas all maltreatment is developmentally harmful, research has confirmed that the level of developmental harm is proportionate to the severity, chronicity, and pervasiveness of the maltreatment they've experienced.
And so what you're saying there is we just need to acknowledge at this stage that there are the varying degrees that we're talking about.
Yes.
And what you're talking about is the upper end, the higher end of severity when it comes to maltreatment. Is that right?
That's right, and so there are two implications for that, really. One is that it is the most severely maltreated children that tend to come into care through the courts, and it's those very children who have had the most adverse developmental experiences. So in other words, the children that are coming into care are the most vulnerable.
And to be clearer, still in the context of this hearing, we're talking international research currently, or the current state, correct?
That's right, and so this is not, what I'm talking about is now, and so historically, children came into care for many other reasons historically.
And we've heard a lot about that, but we won't dwell on that for now. We'll carry on with your brief of evidence. Thank you.
The most illustrative point I can make about this is that the strongest independent predictor of the mental health of children in care is the age that they are when they come into care, with earlier placement into family-based care being a strong protective factor. And this is in spite of what I'm going to talk about in a minute about all of the harmful effects that care actually exerts on children's development. In spite of that, the younger a child is when they're placed into care, the better the mental health generally is throughout their childhood. And at least when we examine this across entire care populations. I think it's important not to interpret this statistic as an endorsement of statutory care, as being generally reparative or therapeutic for these children. Later I'll explain how out-of-home care also compromises many children's development, limiting their recovery from effects of serious maltreatment and sometimes leading to further deterioration in mental health. But the reason why I want to emphasize this is that this statistic refutes a commonly held belief that some children are better off remaining with families who persistently maltreat them than being placed in statutory care, at least in the modern context.
And I suppose what you're saying there is that runs against any proposition that might say we won't act for this reason.
Yeah, so within the field, because people are exposed to all of the problems that statutory care has, and they can see the harm various harms that are caused by the statutory care system, a lot of people working in the field have a crisis of confidence and start to believe that children may be better off if they remain in severely maltreating homes. And the evidence that I've just given you refutes that. That in spite of all the harm that care does, it is a less harmful option than remaining in families where they're being severely and persistently maltreated.
And you're going to come on to this later, but
Yes.
One of the points you pointed out, one of the big questions is what form does that care take, correct?
Yes.
All right.
So I'm not suggesting that we need to choose between two bad options. I'm suggesting that we need to be thinking about what the better option is, yes.
We can pick up again from, I think, paragraph 40 now.
Yes. Let me know if I'm taking too long and I need to move on. Okay. In this next part of my evidence, I want to talk about the mental health of children in long-term statutory care. Over the past 30 years, numerous population studies carried out in countries with comparable care systems to New Zealand have measured the mental health of children and young people in care. Most of these studies were carried out in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Europe and Australia. And these include the study that I conducted that I spoke about earlier. And what's really interesting about this research is just how consistent the estimates are. So around the world, studies are finding much the same results. And whilst no comparable research is being carried out to date in New Zealand, this consistency of international research suggests that New Zealand children in care are likely to have comparable mental health problems, at least as understood and measured within Western epistemologies. And it's important to note that children experience mental ill health within the context of broader developmental impairments, as well as physical health problems and physical disabilities. And to address that, New Zealand has introduced, within the last 5 or 6 years, I think, a cross-government health screening procedure for children entering statutory care called the Gateway Assessment. And this screening assessment seeks to identify not just mental and emotional difficulties, but also learning difficulties, physical ill health resulting from maltreatment, social disadvantage and poverty. And several population studies, including my own, have estimated around a quarter of children in care have some level of intellectual disability and similar rates of language difficulties. However, the most important developmental difficulties experienced by these children, as measured by the number of affected children, their felt experience, the impact on their present well-being and social functioning, the impact on their caregivers, and their future lives, are their mental health difficulties.
And before you move on, at paragraph 47, you said that across these population studies, the estimates, as you've described, have been quite consistent, but that around a quarter of children in statutory care have some level of learning disability or language difficulty. How did that compare to the population of children at large?
That compares to around 2% children at large.
So 25% for children in care across these studies and 2% for children at large. Okay, thank you. If we could return
and
now.
I skipped some of the details there. Thank you.
No, that's fine. I think we were at paragraph 51. Thank you.
And with regards to mental health, international research consistently indicates around half of children in long-term statutory care have mental health difficulties that require clinical intervention or support. And around another quarter have difficulties approaching the need for clinical support. And so that means there's only a quarter of children who are travelling well and otherwise we don't need to be continuing to monitor them. And so for a population, from a public health perspective, this is one of the highest risk populations for mental health difficulties that we have in our society. Also, in addition to the numbers of children that have these problems, what's very pertinent is that the types and combinations of symptoms that children in care experience differ somewhat from that of other children that may have need for clinical services. And this is also the case for severely maltreated children who remain with their parents. So in other words, the mental health problems that I'm talking about are not specific to children in care as such, they're specific to maltreated children. Firstly, the mental health difficulties that children experience whilst growing up in care are mostly trauma-related and attachment-related. And they're also developmentally based, which means that they develop over long periods of time. In particular, difficulties with social and interpersonal relatedness linked to attachment development are hallmark features that differentiate this population from other children with clinical level difficulties. I'm sorry for all the big words. Other characteristic difficulties include relationship insecurity, inattention hyperactivity, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, dissociation, conduct problems and oppositional defiance, self-injury, food maintenance behaviours. This means hoarding, gorging and storing food, abnormal responses to pain, and sexual behaviour problems. However, the most defining feature is not the forms or types of difficulties, but their complexity and severity. In my longitudinal study of 347 children in long-term care in New South Wales, 20% had complex attachment and trauma-related problems that are not adequately explained or classified in either the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's what they call the DSM, it's the Psychiatric Classification Manual, or the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases. And this is one of the reasons why these children require specialised clinical services. In the context of children entering long-term care with seriously compromised psychological development, it is understandable that their mental health difficulties persist whilst growing up in care. That's because these difficulties are developmentally based and thus tend to follow a long-term developmental course. So these are not like simpler problems like anxiety and depression that may arise over a short period of time and can be treated quickly and where the course of the problem can be changed fairly quickly.
And that's because they're developmental problems that have
Yes.
taken a course of time to in the child's development, which is what we've spoken about earlier.
Yes.
Thank you.
So an analogy might be that problems that are not developmentally based, it's like steering a speedboat on the water. You can speed, but developmentally based problems, it's more like how you're trying to change the steering or the course of a big ocean ship. You can't just change it very quickly, it's very slow to change over time.
Yeah. And I think now you're going on to talk about the conditions of a child's development, which lead to a child's development, and what might, in paragraph 61.
So, so the conditions are slow to change, but without improvements in a child's developmental conditions, these more serious problems are likely to become increasingly fixed or trait-like, which is a psychological term, having lifelong implications for social, educational and occupational functioning. On the other hand, even with optimal conditions where the child's care, life circumstances and their care changes dramatically for the better, that recovery tends to be slow, and this often tests their foster parents' commitment and strength. So even in the best of worlds, their recovery, where they do recover, it occurs over long periods of time. I'll now move on to canvass what I believe are the most important things that children need if they are unable to remain in their parents' care. At the start of my evidence, I proposed that severely maltreated children can experience psychological recovery in response to consistently sensitive, loving care, as well as other experiences that engender felt security. I also expressed my belief that the state, by which I mean the government at large and civil society, not just the statutory Child Welfare Department, that the state has a duty of care to do three things for these children. The first was to restore to them their right to experience and enjoy what remains of their childhood in much the same way as do other children. The second was to restore the social and familial conditions that are necessary for healthy human development. And the third was with regard to providing specialised clinical services and support. Although costly, this third priority is perhaps the simplest. It's the most straightforward to achieve because, unlike the first two priorities, we can do this without reforming the statutory care systems. And so here I'm talking about governments providing specialised clinical services for children in care.
And that's because, as you've described earlier, in terms of the complex range of factors which are present in this population of young people, some of the tools which are available within the mental health setting aren't necessarily addressing those. Is that the point?
Yes, and it's not specific to New Zealand. This is a problem all around the world. And I might just talk, because there's a fair bit to get through here, and I think we wanted to get to the other parts, make sure we get to that. But if I can just summarise what I say from paragraph 68 through to 81.
Thank you.
So no government has managed to get this right yet. The government that's done, where it's being done the best is in the United Kingdom. And in this part of the world, New South Wales has shown the most progress in terms of not just the Child Welfare Department, but particularly the Health Department, developing specialised clinical services.
Can we just pause there? I know we're both conscious of the time, but there's a point about what's happened in New South Wales, I think, which might just be worth touching on very briefly. And that's the extent to which they have tried to change the way that they look at their system in terms of care and protection and youth justice. Is that correct?
Well, they've done a number of things. Firstly, in the early years when I was first working in their ministry, they separated out youth justice from child welfare, for the reason being that the institutional approaches to running youth justice services cross-contaminate the way that they care for children in residential services, because the same agency is doing both. It's difficult for them to care for children in residential care in the manner in which a parent would be thinking about a child, when at the same time they are running equivalent institutions for young offenders.
So they're two separate departments, effectively.
Yes, in different ministries. Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Now, if we could.
The second thing they did was that in the 90s, they did a very radical move. It was the Usher inquiry led to the closure of every residential service in New South Wales, so including small group homes. Every single one was closed. And that had some negative consequences in terms of children that were difficult to place, with foster families sometimes winding up living in youth refuges and things. But it was a revolution in terms of forcing the government to confront how do we care for difficult to place children with families. and I think it was largely successful.
Thank you.
Okay.
If we can return to the summary that you were providing around, it's the 4 points that really
I'll just go through the 4 points very quickly. The first is that we know that these children actually consume a disproportionately large amount of generic state-run mental health services. In spite of that, many of them don't get the services that they need, so there's a problem with capacity. And so New Zealand, as with other places in the world, doesn't have enough mental health services to meet the needs of this population, let alone the population at large. Secondly, the existing child and adolescent mental health services, partly because they're so stretched, operate under an acute care model, which means that they're focusing on getting clients in and out as quickly as possible, using brief therapies and brief interventions. And these children need long-term interventions. Yeah.
And that's the point you've made around the cruise liner and the speedboat, developmental versus other more acute.
And the irony is problems. That they don't necessarily need treatment services that are as intensely provided as the acute care services. Sometimes an over-the-radar approach, over-the-horizon approach, is a better one where the children aren't even aware that they're receiving mental health services. It's mainly provided through their carers. So they don't need as intensive services all the time, that they need a service that their caregivers can access that are available, or they don't have, so in other words, presently they have to join queues and then wait and then fall off and then join the queue again and then wait and then fall off. So the other problem is that, as I mentioned, these children have difficulties that are not well understood within existing diagnostic classifications. And that points to the need for, that points to a bigger challenge or problem, which is we don't have a clinical workforce that is sufficiently skilled in terms of understanding. Speaking too fast? No. Oh, sorry. We need more specialised clinicians, and the best way to do that is to train them and to employ them within specialised services.
And on that point, earlier you've talked about Western approaches to this, and later on you'll talk about cultural parameters in terms of relational permanency. But on this point around specialised clinicians, would you support the proposition that a diverse range of clinicians with different cultural backgrounds would add to the workforce in that area?
I think in New Zealand currently around half, or a little more than half, of children in care are Maori. And so I think it's self-evident that the work that I've done has been voiced internationally, so I've not talked specifically about this.
That's right.
But I think it's self-evident that if you were to develop specialised mental health services for children in state care in New Zealand, then you would that has to be not only the model of treatment models and ways of delivering services, but trying to recruit more clinicians from the cultural backgrounds that reflect the population of children in care.
Thank you.
So I think I've covered that enough. And I guess what the last part of my evidence, I'm really wanting to talk about present statutory care systems, the extent to which they meet the needs of children, and specifically focusing on what I see as being systemic factors that compromise children's lives.
And just so we can follow along, we are now at paragraph
82.
82. Thank you.
Just seeing how far I've got to go. A recent review that I carried out of studies that measured longitudinal changes in children's mental health in family-based care found no consistent evidence that care exerts a general population-wide effect on children's mental health. In other words, at least in terms of measuring children's mental health over time, there is no evidence that foster and kinship care are either generally harmful or generally therapeutic. Instead, several longitudinal studies have found that sizable proportions of children show meaningful improvement in their mental health over time, but similar proportions show deterioration in their mental health over time. And if I can refer to my New South Wales study again, around 35% of those children over around 9 to 11 years of time had good mental health at the start and good mental health at the end. A quarter of the children showed meaningful improvement in their mental health. Another quarter showed meaningful deterioration. Things got worse for them. And the final 15%, they had difficulties at the beginning and difficulties at the end that stayed much the same. And so what this kind of draws our attention to, I think, is not asking whether or not care is itself generally harmful or generally therapeutic, but what are the characteristics of care that foster children's development, healthy development, and what are the aspects of care, the care system, that either impede their development or recovery or actually cause further harm. I'm just going now to paragraph 92.
To 92, thank you.
Yeah. Within a family preservation framework, the designated purpose of statutory care shifted in the 1980s and 1990s to temporary protective care, with restoration, meaning restoring the child to their birth family, being the ultimate goal. This reflects the belief that foster care should serve as a support intervention in the aid of family preservation, not as a means for effecting family breakup. The problem is, however, if we look at the reality of what has happened since then, today, statutory care increasingly serves a very different function. I don't have the equivalent statistics for New Zealand, but for example, in Australia, there is an increasing trend for children to enter statutory care at a younger age and to spend the remainder of their childhood in care. And based on current trends, the majority of Australian children placed into care this year will effectively grow up in care. Children experience statutory care through the lens of their previous experiences of harmful care. Harmful, insensitive, and inconsistent parenting adversely affect children's attachment style and how they understand and interpret adult caregiving behaviour. Attachment theory predicts that the developmental effects of statutory care should vary according to the characteristics of a child's attachment development prior to their entry into care. And so, I've written some technical terms here, but basically what I'm saying is that if you've been, as a young child, you were raised by parents where your relationships are very distorted, and maladaptive, then when you are subsequently placed with other families, you still perceive those people and understand relationships through that lens that developed earlier. And so whereas the attachment styles of very young foster children tend to match their foster mother's attachment styles, children who come into care at older ages are more resistant to change despite receiving markedly improved care. Many such children are thus primed for insecurity when they enter care due to their compromised attachment development, as well as the loss of their parents and being placed with unfamiliar carers. Therefore, even with optimal reparative conditions and with specialised clinical support, children's recovery tends to be slow, as I've said before. Whilst growing up in statutory care is preferable to ongoing exposure to maltreatment, there is good evidence that it systemically compromises children's development and well-being. There is accumulating international evidence that the quality of caregiving provided to children in statutory care, caregivers' motivations for fostering children, their commitment and bonding to children placed with them, and of course maltreatment of children in care, all influence children's felt security and psychological development. And these factors regulate their recovery from their mental health difficulties.
And now at this stage, if we could move down to paragraph 112, because it would be good to talk about this idea of a qualified commitment to care, and then go on to talk about the impact of familial love.
So maltreatment in care, we'll skip that. It's at the top. 105.
If we can,
Yep.
I think if we can direct ourselves now to 112.
Okay, yep. The accumulating research challenges a myth embodied within Western statutory care systems that children can be adequately nurtured for the remainder of their childhoods by caregivers who have a qualified commitment to them, so long as those children receive good or adequate day-to-day care. And by that, what I'm saying is that there was a belief, at least within the care system that I've worked in, that it didn't matter whether caregivers and children had bonded to each other as if they belonged to each other. That all that was essential was that children were loved and nurtured on a day-to-day basis. But this kind of misunderstands what the concept of love is, which I should talk about now. While children may not initially understand or respond positively to loving care, over time, familial love is the most important therapeutic mechanism that we have for repairing these children's lives. But familial love and the close relationships that underpin it are not momentary transactions of nurturance or affection. So it's not transactional, and it's not something that we can provide on a time-limited basis as something that we do in terms of behavioural nurturing of children on a day-to-day basis.
And at this point, I think it's probably a good point to jump now to paragraph 117, where you talk about relational permanence.
Put simply, children can only truly feel secure when they acquire relational permanence, and familial love and relationships are not time-limited, they are unending. At this stage, I should also emphasise that relational permanence and the associated felt security that flows from it is experienced and shaped within cultural parameters and shared belief systems. For example, for Maori, felt security does not flow exclusively from close, permanent familial relationships. It also flows from having a secure connection with and a sense of belonging to one's whakapapa and connection to whānau, hapu and iwi. Based on my understanding, the practice of whāngai operates within the strengths of that cultural framework. I also believe that the practice of whāngai provides a vehicle for facilitating relational permanence and felt security for tamariki who otherwise cannot or should not be raised by their parents. Almost all aspects of present statutory care systems work against children acquiring relational permanence and associated felt security, even in cases where foster parents and whānau are strongly motivated to permanently care for a child. Children's felt security is constrained or undermined by the legal, philosophical and historical bases of statutory care systems throughout Western jurisdictions. To illustrate this, I was going to provide some examples, but I won't. But I will just mention, I should best mention that I should refer the Commission to the TV NZ1 documentary, I Am a Survivor of State Care, which provides an historical example in which Darryl Brougham and his former foster parents recount his involuntary removal from their care and the long-lasting effects this had on all of them. My experience has been that children who are growing up in long-term care begin to fully understand their legal and care status from about age 6 or 7. In my clinical work, I've observed that this growing awareness is often accompanied by increasing insecurity about the possibility of that child losing or being taken from their caregivers. In my New South Wales longitudinal study, one of the clearest predictors of children's mental health problems was foster parents' perceptions of placement security. Within the confines of family relationships, felt insecurity of one family member impacts on the felt security of others. Thus, foster parents' own concerns about a child's tenure with them can raise anxiety within the family system. This can be quite detrimental when children are already highly anxious about their placement security. Statutory care systems adhere to the myth that caregivers can simultaneously nurture and love children as much as any child might need, but that those caregivers should also be able to readily let go of those children if the agency decides they should be returned to their parents or moved to another placement. In practice, I believe that this is rarely achieved and that there is an inevitable trade-off between the level of nurturance and expressed love and a caregiver's ability to let go. I'll move now to paragraph 147. Let me know if I'm taking too long.
Carry on, thank you.
By and large, out-of-home care services are staffed by very caring and empathic professionals. And yet, complex systemic factors deny these children the possibility of enjoying the same standard of care and the same experience of childhood that most children enjoy. The most intractable problem within our system of legally impermanent statutory care is placement disruptions and placement instability.
Now, at this stage, could I ask you, and whilst a difficult task, to summarise some of the points that you've made around placement disruption and placement instability. And that's starting on page 16, paragraph 149.
I can skip a lot of this. Yeah. Okay. There are two main problems. Well, first of all, placement instability is very common in statutory care. Some of it occurs because children are moved in a planned way, and when they're moved from placement to placement in a planned way, it may be because a child is being moved from a supposedly temporary placement to a permanent placement. But not enough thought is given to how that affects children. The most common reason children move is because placements disrupt or break down. And the most often stated reason for that is foster parents or whānau carers not being able to cope with children's behavioural difficulties or their unusual or problematic interpersonal relatedness difficulties, so their attachment behaviours. And we haven't had enough research to definitively map out and show exactly what the psychological toll is on children when their placements break down. And the reason for that is, it's a technical reason. But numerous qualitative studies of children growing up in care, children describe the devastating effects of placement moves and placement breakdowns.
As a matter contributing to placement breakdown, would you add if the mental health level of mental health support is deficient or not adequate, that would be a factor which would contribute to placement breakdown?
It is, and so it works in the other way as well, and that is that even placement breakdowns incur a toll in terms of children's mental health. So we see a spiral. What we typically see is a spiralling pattern where after the first placement breakdown, the likelihood of another one increases because children are their children's distorted views of themselves and of others. The breakdown confirms their distorted views. And so they're living in a dangerous, rejecting world. They see themselves as being unlovable, and they see the placement breakdown as being inevitable. And so over time, you get this reverberating cycle that we see this pattern with older children and adolescents where eventually they are placed in residential care. But I think the biggest cost of placement breakdowns is that every time one happens, the clock is reset for this child actually developing a permanent relationship. That's actually a bigger cost because whilst ever a child is moving from placement to placement, they're adrift and they're alone. And the more chance it is that when they reach adulthood as a 17 or an 18-year-old, they are literally alone in the world. And so the mental health service, in terms of the specialised service approach for these children, the number one goal is not to bring about some improvement in their mental health in the short term. The number one goal is to maintain children's placements. Because if you can do that early on and keep placements that are at risk viable so that caregivers and children become closer to each other and they develop stronger bonds to each other, and foster parents and whānau carers are adequately supported to deal with the problems that children have, then we reduce the risk of placement breakdown. And the placement breakdown is the catastrophe more than the mental health problems getting worse, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Shortly we're going to take a break, but before we do that, I just wondered if you had any final points that you wanted to make in closing, Professor Tarren-Sweeney.
I've probably spoken too long.
No, it's.
I mean, I can read my conclusion.
Thank you.
Would that be it? Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
So today I've presented evidence that I believe supports the case that statutory care systems are not able to restore to children their right to experience and enjoy what remains of their childhood in much the same way as do other children. And that an impermanent care system cannot provide children with the social and familial conditions that are necessary for healthy human development and that are also preconditions for their developmental recovery. I believe that the experience of growing up in statutory care in the Western world constitutes an unnatural childhood, one that exposes our most vulnerable children to unique developmental risks that other children do not encounter. Furthermore, there is good evidence to show that these developmental risks are systemically interconnected. It involves a complex interaction of child welfare practices, caregiver motivation, the child's experience of impermanence, and felt insecurity. The core problem is that this system sees many children growing up without acquiring permanent relationships. In other words, without enjoying unconditional, lifelong commitment by a loving family. My present research focuses on designing and testing a developmental theory, which I call impermanence theory, and I should skip that because we're running out of time.
No,
but the theory proposes that felt security is the core psychological state that underpins developmental recovery, and that it can't be fully attained without close, permanent familial relationships.
And it would be interesting to hear about how some of the work you've done to try and test that theory in terms of your research.
It's still in its early stages, but partly what I've been doing is unusual for a psychologist, but I've been doing some historical work to test this. Well, humans are a social species that evolved such that close and enduring familiar relationships are essential for their psychosocial development. So in other words, if that part of our lives is actually non-negotiable, that all of us do this, then that provides evidence for it actually having an evolutionary basis. In other words, what I'm looking for is any evidence historically or cross-culturally where children are raised in a similar way to how we raise children in care would potentially provide evidence that we can, as a species, cope with this. And so I've searched as far back as pre-Christian Europe and the early Roman Empire, as well as ethnographic accounts of traditional societies throughout the world. And so far, I've not found any such precedent. And what this tells us is that the absence of such precedents infers this experience lies outside the boundaries of human adaptation as determined by our DNA. In other words, the being raised without a semblance of a permanent family is both developmentally harmful and contrary to human evolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, first, tēnā koe mō tēnā, tēnei te mihi nui ki a koe, Professor Tarren-Sweeney, tō kōrero I tēnei ata, so a big acknowledgement to you. I'll just turn to the chair now to see whether it might be an appropriate time, although slightly early, sir.
Yes, I think I speak for all my colleagues. This would be a good time to take the morning break. When we resume, council, if they wish, can ask Professor questions. Is that the way in which you're going to do it, or are we going to hear from Dr. Rapsey first?
No, we'll hear from Dr. Rapsey first and then have questions to round off.
Very well. Well, we'll take the break and then we'll receive the evidence of Dr. Rapsey.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.